Whenever we'd visit my grandma, she always had this story she liked to tell. She'd sit in her favorite old rocking chair, the one with the creaky wood, and talk about the strange, eerie noises she'd hear coming from the forest at night. It always gave me a bit of a chill, but I never thought much of it. We arrived at her place late on a Saturday afternoon. The sun was just starting to dip behind the trees, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple. After unloading the car, my dad and I sat out on the porch, cracking open a couple of cold beers and talking about nothing in particular. It was one of those moments where time seemed to slow down and everything just felt peaceful. That night, we all turned in early. Grandma had planned an egg hunt for the kids, my niece and nephew, and she made it sound like the highlight of the weekend. I figured I'd better get some sleep, knowing how chaotic little kids can be when they're hyped up for something. But around 1 a.m., I woke up. Nature was calling, and there wasn't much I could do about it. I shuffled out of bed, trying not to wake anyone, and headed downstairs to the bathroom. The house was quiet, too quiet maybe, and the faint smell of pine and old wood hung in the air, like it always did at Grandma's. After I finished up, I started making my way back upstairs. That's when I froze. Just as I reached the base of the stairs, I heard it, my dad calling out for me. His voice sounded strange, almost like it was coming from somewhere deep in the house. I followed the sound of his voice, my feet barely making a sound on the old wooden floor. It seemed like it was coming from outside, just beyond the front door. Half asleep and more confused than anything else, I started heading that way, figuring maybe Dad had stepped out for some air or something. But before I even reached the door, something made me stop dead in my tracks. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed him. Dad was right there, slumped on the couch. The faint glow of the moonlight spilling in from the window lit up the room just enough for me to see him clearly. A few empty beer bottles were scattered on the floor around him, and it was obvious he hadn't moved an inch since he passed out earlier that night. That's when I heard it again, his voice calling out my name. But this time, I noticed something wasn't right. It wasn't just weird that I was hearing him while he was clearly knocked out on the couch. The voice itself sounded off. It was hard to explain, but it was like someone had recorded him talking and then played it back through one of those cheap voice changers you'd get at a Halloween store. It was distorted in a way that made my skin crawl, almost as if whoever or whatever was out there didn't quite know how to mimic him perfectly. And the strangest part? The sound wasn't distant or faint. It was right outside the door. I stood there, my heart thudding in my chest, staring at the door like it might suddenly burst open. For a moment, I didn't know what to do. My gut was telling me something was seriously wrong, but my brain hadn't quite caught up yet. I crept toward the front door, each step slower than the last, my pulse pounding in my ears. My hand hovered near the doorknob, but something held me back. A strange uneasiness settled over me like a heavy blanket, and I decided to take a detour to the window instead, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever or whoever was out there. Pulling the curtain back just enough to peek through, I pressed my face close to the glass. At first, I couldn't see much, just pitch black, the kind of darkness you only get this far out in the country. But then my eyes adjusted, and I noticed the faint outline of a figure standing motionless right at the door. First, I thought it was a man. The shape was tall, broad-shouldered, and eerily still. But as I squinted, trying to make out more details, my stomach sank. The figure wasn't human, not even close. From its head, I could just make out horns curling upward like those of some kind of beast or a demon. My breath caught in my throat, and before I could even think about ducking out of sight, the figure moved. It turned its head and looked directly at me, as if it had known I was watching the entire time. That's when I saw them. Its eyes, glowing a piercing, unnatural red that seemed to burn straight into me. I froze, unable to move, unable to look away. Then it spoke, and I'll never forget the sound of that voice. It was my dad's voice or something trying to sound like him, but there was something terribly wrong with it, like it was stretched and twisted in ways that didn't belong. And what it said made my blood run cold. "Daniel, please let me in." The way it said my name, it wasn't a request. It was almost a command, but there was something mocking about it, like it was toying with me. That was it. My survival instincts kicked in, and I didn't waste another second. I bolted from the window, racing through the house as fast as my legs would carry me. Every single door, every window, I checked them all, making sure they were locked tight. My hands were shaking so badly it was hard to even turn the locks. Strangely, no one else stirred. Not a single sound came from my grandma's room or where the kids were sleeping. It was like the entire house was under some kind of spell, and I was the only one who knew what was happening. By the time I finally sat down, my back pressed against the wall, I was drenched in sweat and my heart was hammering so hard it hurt. The figure never knocked, never tried to break in, but it didn't need to. Just the memory of those glowing red eyes and that distorted voice was enough to keep me wide awake until the first rays of sunlight finally broke through the trees. Easter morning came, and the house was alive with the sounds of laughter and chaos. My niece and nephew were tearing through the yard, baskets in hand, searching for brightly colored eggs my grandma had carefully hidden the day before. Everyone else seemed to be in good spirits, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The memory of what I'd seen or thought I'd seen the night before was burned into my mind. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't focus on the holiday or the family around me. Every time I glanced out a window or stepped outside, I felt it, that heavy, suffocating sensation of being watched. It wasn't just paranoia. It felt real, like something unseen was lingering just out of sight, waiting for the right moment. When it was finally time to leave, I helped pack up the car, eager to get back home where I hoped I'd feel safe again. As we pulled out of the driveway, I let out a small sigh of relief. But just as we were rounding the bend at the edge of the property, something caught my eye. At the edge of the tree line, partially hidden among the shadows of the tall pines, it stood there. Even from the car, I could tell it was enormous, easily 7 feet tall, maybe more. Its body was covered in thick, matted black hair, the kind that looked wild and tangled, like it had never been brushed. It stood upright, with the broad shoulders and build of a man, but everything else about it was wrong. Its legs were partially hidden by the underbrush, but I was certain, somehow, deep in my gut, that if I could see them, they'd end in hooves. And its head, that was the worst part. It looked like some twisted combination of a goat and an old homeless man, aged and weathered. The horns curled out from its skull in uneven, jagged spirals, and its face seemed to almost sag, like it carried the weight of something unspeakable. For a moment, I just stared, my heart pounding as I tried to convince myself it wasn't real. But then, as if it knew I was looking, the creature turned its head ever so slightly toward me. Even though I couldn't make out its eyes from that distance, I felt them, sharp, burning, and fixed right on me. Before I could get a better look, it moved. Without a sound, the thing turned and melted back into the shadows of the forest, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. I didn't say a word to anyone. What could I even say? I just sat there in silence, gripping the seatbelt like it was the only thing keeping me grounded, as the car carried us farther and farther away from Grandma's house. I haven't breathed a word of this to my family. What would I even say? Hey, by the way, I saw some kind of demon Goatman lurking outside Grandma's house. They'd think I'd lost my mind, or worse, that I'd had one too many beers that night. No, I've kept this to myself, but the thought of it still lingers, gnawing at the back of my mind. One thing I know for sure, I'm grateful I didn't open that door. I don't even want to imagine what would have happened if I had. I probably wouldn't be here now, sitting safely at home, writing this down. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't something you'd want to meet face to face. But the part that keeps me awake at night isn't just what happened to me. It's the fact that it's still out there. Somewhere in those woods, that creature is lurking, watching, waiting. And what terrifies me the most is the thought that next time, it might go after someone else. Maybe my grandma or even the kids. I've replayed that night 1,000 times in my head, and no matter how much I try to rationalize it, there's no getting around what I saw and heard. This wasn't just my imagination, and it wasn't some random animal wandering too close to the house. That thing was real, and it had intelligence, enough to mimic my dad's voice and call out to me, enough to know I was looking at it through the window. So, if you're reading this and you happen to live in the Ozarks in Missouri, or maybe you're planning a trip out there, consider this a warning. Be careful. Stay vigilant. And if you ever hear someone calling out to you in the dead of night, especially if it sounds just a little off, do yourself a favor. Don't check it out. Whatever it is, it's better left alone.